Hi everyone, welcome to Noaa Live. My name is Lisa Hiruki-Raring and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. This series is a collaborative effort by Noaa Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center where I work, NOAA's Office of Education, along with the National Sea Grant College Program, and it's supported by Woods Hole Sea Grant and NOAA's Regional Collaboration Network. All of our speakers work for some part of NOAA, that's NOAA or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Today, we're introducing you to Erin, Fedewa, and Leah Zacher from NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center's Kodiak Laboratory. Erin and Leah gave a talk on crabs last fall, and the Kodiak Lab also did a lab tour this past spring. So if you're interested in checking out their past talks, look for the recordings on the NOAA Live website. We'll be talking about Alaskan crabs today, and we'll be showing you how to identify crustaceans, which is another word for the group of animals that crabs are in. So we'll be talking about crustaceans found in Alaska waters, and we'll talk about crab biology with live appearances from some crabby guests. We'll even find out how to tag a red king crab and explore how researchers use these tags to study where crabs live and how they move. While we'll be talking about NOAA's role in research and stewardship, we want to recognize that we're all coming to you from the traditional lands of Native communities who have substantial traditional and local Indigenous knowledge and much to share with us. NOAA respectfully acknowledges that Kodiak Island is the Alutiiq Sugpiaq homeland. We thank and acknowledge the tribes of the Kodiak Alutiiq region. The heritage and culture of the Alutiiq people continue to enrich the community. We'd also like to acknowledge that we're hosting this webinar from the traditional lands of the Coast Salish, including the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people past and present. I also want to extend a special thank you to our American Sign Language interpreters, Crystal Butler and Jillian Trommer. A few guidelines before I hand you over to Erin and Leah. You're all muted because we have a lot of people on the line. However, there's a chat box where you can write questions, and we encourage you to do that as we go along. If we don't get to your questions, no worries, we'll give you some resources so that you can look things up after the webinar, and you can always check out the NOAA Live website. Also, Erin and Leah have generously agreed to answer questions that we don't get to, so we'll post the answers along with the recording of today's webinar on the NOAA Live website. We'll also have some questions for you throughout the webinar, so get ready to type in that chat box. All right, I'm all set, so I'm going to turn it over to our speakers to introduce themselves. So Erin, Leah, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Erin. And I'm Leah, and we're both NOAA fisheries biologists in Kodiak, Alaska. So today, we're going to be talking about crab, and specifically crab that live in Alaska. But first of all, since some of you may not be that familiar with crab, let's talk about what makes a crab a crab. So in the chat box, can you list some characteristics of crab? And you can use this picture to help you think about what makes a crab.
So for those of you in our audience, please feel free to type into your question box or your question box what you think are the characteristics of what makes a crab, and we are getting answers in already. So Barbara is saying that it has a hard shell. Theodore says that crabs walk sideways. Marcus's class says that they crawl. Jody is saying that they have an exoskeleton, and Texas clarifies that, saying that they have a hard exoskeleton. And then Wynn is saying that it has 8 legs and pinchers. Oh, that's from Liam, not Wynn, sorry. And Katie is also talking about pinchers as opposed to legs. Summerlin is saying that it has 8 question mark legs. Rena is saying that it has 9 legs with 2 claws. Teresa is saying that it's a bottom dweller, and Jennifer is saying that Crimson says that it has pinchers. And Michelle says that they're good to eat. So, Leah, what do you say? What makes a crab a crab?
Good job, everyone. Those were really good examples of what makes a crab a crab. Those are great. So here's some things that I think about when I think about what is a crab. So first of all, crabs are invertebrates, so they don't have a backbone like we do. And lots of you said crabs have an exoskeleton. So if you're not familiar with what is an exoskeleton, it's a skeleton that's on the outside of their body. So our skeleton is on the inside of our body, and all of our muscles and everything else and skin is supported by that internal skeleton. But crabs have their skeleton on the outside. So it's like they're kind of living inside a hard box. So if you feel a crab, that's why they feel hard on the outside, is because that's their skeleton on the outside. Now crabs are related to other crustaceans like shrimp, but they don't have a big tail. They still have a tail flap or abdomen, but it's folded underneath the body. I'll show that to you shortly. Also, lots of you were saying that crabs have 8 walking legs and 2 pinchers or claws or chela. And that's very correct. So these are all kind of the characteristics that make kind of a true crab. Now there are some other things that look like crabs, but they're not as closely related. So they're not actually kind of a group of true crabs. And we'll look at some of those too. And they tend to have fewer legs. So let's go look at some Alaskan crabs. Let's start out with this crab. This is a tanner crab. Tanner crabs live in our waters right here around Kodiak. And we can see at the front, she has these 2 claws or chela that she can use to get food to her mouth. She has mouth parts right here that help manipulate the food. She has 2 big eyes in the front and tiny little antenna. And if we count her legs, she has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 walking legs that she can walk with, and then her 2 claws. If we look at the bottom, you see this big circular part on the bottom. That is the tail flap or abdomen of the tanner crab. So can you guys tell me if this is a male or a female crab? Do you guys know? You can put that in the chat box.
All right, so what do you think? Is this crab a male or a female? And maybe there are some guesses that people might have. Let's see. We have a bunch of people. Let's see. Texas, Liam, Rena, Theodore are all saying female. Mrs. Marcus's class is thinking it's a boy. Allison Paul thinks it's a she, a female. So it's more people I think are saying female than male, but they're people who are guessing both. Oh, Brian is saying it's a female because there's a wide tail. And Jody is saying female because you said she.
You're right. I did give it away a little bit, didn't I? It's a female.
Yes, we've got some very smart people.
We do. It is because she has this big, wide tail flap, and that's how we tell it's a female. Now let's look at a male crab. So this one this one here, it's actually a snow crab, not a tanner crab, but they look very similar, as you can see. And this one is a male. And the easy ways we can tell is that it has this smaller tail flap underneath. And I can hold up the female again so you can see how different that is. You can also see that his chela or pinchers are much bigger, especially when the males get mature, they get really big pinchers. Not in all crab species, but in a lot of them. You can see, look at him, he's moving his mouth parts right now. You can really see how he has so many mouth parts to manipulate food and get it into his mouth. Okay, so we saw a snow crab and a tanner crab, and those are both really important crab in Alaska because they're caught in fisheries with bigger populations. So I'll put those ones down, and let's look at some other Alaskan crab. So first of all, how about a helmet crab? Wet here. So here's a helmet crab. You can see just the different shape. Now the top of a crab here is called the carapace. So the carapace is just the top of the shell. You can see his chela or pinchers again. And just look at all that as hairs. The helmet crabs are really hairy. And look, you can see his antennae are a little bit bigger than the other two, so they're standing out a little bit more. So although they will have differences, they have a lot of similarities too among all the crab species. Let's look at something else. What should we look at this one? How about a red rock crab? Here's a red rock crab. These ones are right around here in Kodiak. And very similar to the red rock crab is the little pygmy rock crab. So the pygmy rock crab don't get very big, and they like to nestle down and hide in amongst little shells and boulders. And there, you can see they have pretty big claws, even though they're so tiny. Okay, now let's look at some crabs that have longer, more delicate legs. Here's a tube crab. They look kind of similar. They're different species. Let me turn them around for you. So this one here is called a lyre crab. And this one is a decorator crab. And the decorator crab, you can really see they decorate themselves. So they help camouflage. They can put all sorts of different things on top of their shell. So you can see all those white blobs. Those are all sponges that are growing. They're a living animal that's on top of the decorator crab. And they can put all sorts of different things. The sponges are just what this particular one put on it. So that's really fun. And it really helps them blend in their environment. So far we've looked at crabs that all have all the characteristics of a true crab. Let's look at that decorator crab one more time and look at its legs. So remember, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 legs, 2 pinchers or chela. But we have some other crab that don't have as many legs. Now, many of you have probably heard of hermit crabs. Ooh, let's see if we can get this one. We have a couple here. They tend to be shy. I have 2 hermit crabs here. You can see this. And they live inside snail shells. So they didn't grow this shell, but they live inside of it. And when they want to get bigger, they actually have to find a new snail shell. These ones are both scared because I just pulled them out of the water. So they're hiding inside their shell. But you can see the big claw of this one sticking out. But hermit crabs aren't really considered true crabs because they actually don't have as many legs that they use for walking. They only use 4 legs for walking, not 8 legs. They still have those extra legs, but they're modified to hold them inside the shell. So they walk with 4 legs, and the other extra 4 legs are these tiny little pegs that hold them inside the shell so they can stay inside their protective shell. Now, closely related to hermit crab are actually one of our largest Alaskan crab species. Here is, this is a fairly small one, but here is a king crab. This is a red king crab, and they're one of our really pretty crab that live around here and are also caught in fisheries. But let's count the king crab's walking legs. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So only 6 legs and 2 claws. So what happened to the other 2 legs? Well, the other 2 legs are actually, here we can see one of them poking out just a little bit. It's tiny, and it's actually modified for cleaning the gills. So they don't use it for walking, they use it for cleaning their gills instead. So it's really interesting that these king crabs are much more closely related to hermit crabs than they are related to any of those other crabs like the tanner crabs and snow crabs that we looked at first. So I'd like to take any questions that you have about all of these crab that we are seeing. These are not all the crabs that live in Alaska, but it's a good sample of them.
Okay, well, Theodore has some questions about the crabs that you were showing. He was wondering whether the crabs will be released eventually, or whether he called them domestic crabs, or whether they're crabs that live in the Kodiak lab.
These crab all live in our lab because we have a touch tank and an aquarium here. So most of them are either the king crab and tanner crab and snow crab are used for scientific studies here, and the other crab are used to show anyone who lives here who can come into the aquarium what kinds of animals we have that live in our waters around here. Unfortunately, if you live in Kodiak, our aquarium is closed right now, but hopefully it will be open soon.
So Liam was wondering, why are king crabs related more to hermit crabs?
King crabs actually evolved from hermit crabs. That's just how it happened. One thing that we can tell is that hermit crabs are not bilaterally symmetrical. They're not symmetrical on both sides of their body because they have to be able to hold themselves in that spirally snail shell. And if we look at this king crab here at the bottom, even though basically she looks the same on both sides, but if we look at the bottom here, look at those plates. They're not all the same on both sides. They're kind of asymmetrical. They're different. And that's one way that we can tell that king crabs probably came from an ancestor that wasn't bilaterally symmetrical like that.
Great. So Miss Harai's class from Hawaii were wondering, how big can a king crab get?
Oh, that's a really good question. Let's see. They can get, well, their body can probably get about this big. The males get bigger than females, and then their legs, it can expand a lot further on beyond that. So
they can get pretty big, in other words.
Yeah, the males are probably a kind of normal sized big male would be 8 pounds, 9 pounds.
Because a related question is, her class was wondering why the crabs are smaller in Hawaii than they are in Alaska.
There's very different types of species of crabs in different locations. So it's kind of just what species of crab live in what location.
Okay. Well, we have a lot of questions here, but I think that we have a lot of material to cover too. So maybe we should go on to our next section.
All right. Hi, everyone. It's Erin again. We're going to talk a little bit about the life cycle of a crab next. And we'll actually get to see the really little crab under a microscope, which is pretty cool. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at our king crab life cycle. So as an adult female red king crab, she holds her eggs on the bottom for up to a year. And as soon as those eggs hatch, they hatch into what are called larvae. And crab larvae are basically, they're basically tiny. So if you hold out your finger, think of crab larvae as the size of a sesame seed. So you need a little magnifying glass to look at them. And what makes crab larvae is that they actually look a lot different than the crab we just saw, right? So crab larvae actually look more like a shrimp. So you'll see kind of that first picture there up on the left. That crab larvae has big spines on the top of his head. And then the next stage of larvae is kind of starting to look a little bit more like a crab, but he's got a tail. So the real difference in crab larvae is that after they hatch, they're on the surface of the ocean and they actually swim. So they're not really like we think of crab that stay on the bottom of the ocean, and they continue to change to resemble crab. So the larvae's main job is basically to try to find a good spot on the ocean floor to settle. And as soon as they settle, they're called juveniles. So juveniles look exactly like adult crab, but they're teeny tiny. So we're going to look at a couple juveniles that we have here in Kodiak. This guy, you can see how small he is. He's just on the little tip of my finger there. That is a juvenile red king crab. He's pretty teeny tiny. You can see all of his spines. And then here we have a juvenile snow crab. Look at, she's super active. She's waving her little legs. So see how small they are? So that these juveniles basically settle on the ocean floor even smaller than this. And when they're called juveniles, they look a lot more like what we think a crab would look like. So now we're gonna actually look at some eggs on a slide. But first, I'm gonna ask you guys a pop quiz question. Where do you think a female crab stores her eggs? Go ahead and type your answer into the chat box.
So where do you think a female crab stores her eggs? If you guys have any ideas, please type them into the chat box. So Liam is saying on her bottom. Texas is saying under her tail. Rena is also saying under the tail. We've got some pretty smart kids here. Summerlin is also saying tail flap. Theodora is saying underneath her. Allison Paul saying under the tail flap. Teresa is saying on her belly. Rachel was wondering whether it might be below her throat. Jody is saying under the tail. So there's a lot of people saying under the tail or in the belly, underneath her somehow.
Yeah, and Leah actually gave us a really good guess. So females store their eggs under that big abdomen flap that she talked about. That is how we know a female crab is a female crab. So we're going to take a look at this female red king crab because she's got a clutch of eggs. So I'm going to go ahead and hold her up and you guys can see if you can see her eggs under there. Isn't that cool? So she's got a clutch of eggs. And these eggs, red king crab females can have up to 500,000 little eggs. So that is a ton of eggs. But they're so small, and the little embryo or the little baby crab that develop inside of them, we really need a microscope to look at. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So you guys now are going to be the scientists, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at some eggs under a microscope. We're going to look at 2 different samples of eggs, and I want you guys to be scientists and take some observations, and you're going to tell me what you see, okay? So I'll show you what these eggs look like really quick. They're just very, very tiny. So I have a microscope slide with a clump of eggs here, and you can see they just kind of look like a big orange blob. Maybe not quite the eggs that you'd eat for breakfast, huh? So we're going to go ahead and put these on the microscope, and we're going to take a look. You guys can make some mental notes about what you see. Wow, look at that. How cool. That's pretty neat. Okay, so I've got another sample of some different eggs here, and I'm going to go ahead and set these on the microscope. Whoa, that looks a little bit different. Okay, scientists, let's hear what you saw. So we have our 2 different samples of eggs. What do you guys think? How do they look different, or how do they maybe look the same?
So it looks like Shirley was saying that they look like grapes. And I think that that was the left-hand picture there.
Yeah.
Karen is saying that, that's a question, sorry. Theodore was saying that they look orange, yellow-orange. Liam is saying that they look like they're connected by strings. The egg looks like eyes on the second one, on the right-hand side.
Oh my gosh, you guys are so observant.
Rachel is saying, I see a ball and at the end is a stalk. Liam is also saying that it looks like an alien head. And Theodore is also saying, and they also have little cords connected to them. Emily is saying that they have eye spots on the right-hand side one. And Teresa was saying on the first one, they are on a stem. The single one is more defined. They look like blown glass. Ms. Marcos's class is saying that they look like tiny tomatoes. And Rena is saying that the right one is further developed.
Ooh, wow. You guys would make some incredible scientists because those are awesome observations. So yeah, we heard someone said they look a little bit like grapes, right? And actually, I really like that someone said that they look kind of orangish, almost like the yolk on an egg that you would eat for breakfast. So that egg sample that you see on the left, that orange coloration there, you're totally right, is actually the yolk of the egg. And that's where that little embryo, which is that little white shape in the middle of the egg, that's where the embryo gets all of their nutrients. So that yolk is really important. And you guys also noted on the right that that crab embryo actually has developed a set of eyes, and you are 100% right. So give yourself a pat on the back if you observe that. So that embryo on the right is actually more further developed than the embryos we see on the left. So that little tiny baby crab is getting closer to hatching because it's already developed its eyes. So that is super cool. Do you guys have any questions about the life cycle or embryos?
So Karen was wondering, is climate change affecting crab populations?
Wow, that's a great question. And that is something that we as scientists are really trying to understand. So we know that species like snow crab that Leah showed you a little bit earlier get their name because they really live in these cold, cold waters up in the Bering Sea, all the way up into the Arctic in really cold waters. So we as scientists are trying to understand how, especially changes in temperature, influence the life cycle of the crab, like what we just saw. So for example, Leah will talk a little bit about crab movement, but do changes in water temperature influence where crab move, or how they kind of transition, grow, and survive through these life cycles? So that's something that we are still trying to understand, but that's such a great question.
And then going back to our previous list of questions, Alice in the 3rd grade had wanted to know, why does the king crab need to clean his gills?
Oh, why does he need to what?
Clean his gills, you know, those last washing legs.
Yeah, so crab have gills kind of like fish, right? So they need to be able to pull oxygen from the water. So the more they can the more they can circulate and keep those gills clean, basically that allows them to be able to effectively pull oxygen from the water, and that's how they're able to breathe. That's a good question too. You guys have tons of good questions.
And then several people were asking about whether all of the crabs that you showed, that Leah showed earlier, are edible, or are some not edible?
Well, I'm sure you could eat them if you wanted to, right? A hermit crab, that would be kind of hard. So you could probably eat all the crab if you wanted to, but so think about when you eat a crab, you have to crack open all their legs, which I think is a lot of work, but to me it's worth it because crab are delicious. But the smaller the crab get, it might be a little bit more difficult to eat them just because they don't have as much muscle tissue in their legs. So their legs are little itty bitty tiny, and you're probably not going to get very much crab meat from those little crab.
Great. And then there's also a related question about whether some crabs might be farmed for eating.
Also a good question. So we currently, we don't have none of the crab here at the lab are actually raised for people to eat. They're all used for science and for experiments. But we've actually done some experiments right out here in our front yard, which is basically the Gulf of Alaska, in trying to basically what's called stocking red king crabs. So we're asking whether or not we can put little baby red king crab out into the ocean to see if they can basically grow up into adults to be able to replenish the population to actually have a fishery. But we here don't currently raise any crab to eat. But elsewhere in the world, they certainly do, because it turns out we really like to eat crab.
Yes, crab is delicious, that's for sure. All right, I see that we have more questions, but I know that we have more stuff to cover, and some of what you're going to talk about in the next section, I think, will answer some of these questions. So why don't we move on to our next section?
Awesome. Okay, well, next, we were just looking at these little tiny eggs under a microscope, but this is me holding a giant male red king crab. So I'm wondering how those little tiny eggs that we just saw might grow up to be a huge male red king crab like this. So does anyone know how a crab grows? Go ahead and type in the chat box if you think you know.
All right, so if you think you know how a crab grows bigger, then go ahead and put your suggestions in the chat box. We have a couple people already. Theodore had a comment that he really likes the question crab emoji. Emily was let's see, Emily is saying ecdysis, which is a very technical term. Theodore and Texas from Colorado both say that the crab sheds its skin. Jody is saying it molts its shell and grows another one. Summerlin was also saying that they shed their skin. Rena is saying their legs fall off and new ones grow. And she said they molt. And Brian had also said they molt. Michelle says that they replace their shells. Rena also says they molt. And Jennifer says that Carly says that they shed their exoskeleton. So we've got some pretty on the ball viewers here.
Yeah, I think you guys should be up here giving this talk. So a lot of you said molting, which is 100% right. That is how crab grow. So raise your hand if you've ever grown out of a pair of your shoes. I definitely have. So that's kind of similar to how a crab grows, right? Because we have this hard exoskeleton of a shoe, right, that does not get bigger, but our feet continue to grow. And that's when we have to tell our moms or our dads that we need to go out and get new shoes because our feet are growing too big and they don't fit in our shoes. So crab, to be able to grow, have to shed that hard outer exoskeleton that Leah told you about a little bit. So to do this, basically what happens a couple days before a crab goes to molt, it basically takes on a bunch of water and it kind of swells up like a balloon. And I actually have a crab molt here for you. So this is a red king crab that molted in our lab and left behind this molt. And you can hear how brittle it is, right? Because basically it's just the exoskeleton of a crab. So it basically swells up and it breaks this seam, and then it can crack, it can back out of its shell and it leaves this behind. And you can hear how crunchy this is, right? It's really light. It's literally just the shell of a crab that it leaves behind. And it's gonna back itself out of this shell and it's gonna be bigger because it's grown. So we're going to watch a really cool video of a red king crab that's molting in the lab, and we're going to check out what happens when a crab molts. So here we see this red king crab is starting to back out of that shell, and you can see his back couple of legs are coming out first, and he's kind of pushing to get out of that old shell, right? And you'll see his front legs and his big chelas, his claws coming out next. And then basically once he gets out of that shell, he's gonna leave that molt behind. And then he's gonna now harden up in his new exoskeleton, in his new shell, and he's now bigger, which is pretty darn cool. Okay, so now that we talked about how a crab grows, I'm wondering how we age a crab. And I have a list of my hypotheses or my guesses. So how I think we might age a crab. And we're gonna go through them. So number one, we count the candles on their birthday cake. Maybe size, a bigger crab might be older. Or we could use kind of like how we can count rings on a tree to tell how old the tree is. We could maybe count growth rings on a crab's exoskeleton. Or we could look at the age of their exoskeleton. So if crab maybe start to have things like barnacles on them, we could maybe think that that crab might be older. So those are my hypotheses. I would love to hear if you guys agree, or if you guys think that maybe I missed something. Maybe there's a different way to age a crab that I don't know about. So go ahead and let me know in the chat box what you think about those guesses or hypotheses.
So what do you guys think? Why don't you type into the chat box the letters of the ways that you think that scientists figure out how old a crab is?
Yeah, or maybe if you agree with me, you could just say, I think hypothesis B is right. Or maybe I that you guys thought of and I haven't even.
Okay, so Theodore is saying he thinks that it's B and C. He didn't think that D would work because they keep shedding their skin.
Oh,
Texas is thinking that you count the number of candles on their birthday cake. I think that he's kidding on that one. Linda is thinking B and D. Summerlin is thinking B. Harley says B. Michelle says C. And Jillian says D. And the kindergarten class thinks B, that bigger must be older. Let's see. Rena is saying B, C, and D. So it looks like there's a bunch of combinations. A lot of people are saying B, but there's a good combination of different hypotheses that are being put forth by our viewers.
Awesome. You guys are true scientists. We always have lots of hypotheses, right? So we're going to go through these choices and we're going to maybe think about why some might be better methods to age crab than others. So the first one, we talked about counting candles on a birthday cake. That was kind of more of a joke, right? Because I think that making a birthday cake on the bottom of the ocean for a crab might be kind of hard to do. I have a hard enough time baking a cake on land, so I don't know how that works. But this little guy that I showed you earlier, this little juvenile red king crab, if we actually hatched him in the lab, which we did, if we actually hatched him as a little egg here in Kodiak, we can know how old the crab is. So because this crab was hatched here, we know that he's 1.5 years old. So maybe if we wanted to have a birthday party for him, we could count his candles on his cake because we know how old he is. So our second guess that a lot of people, I think, agreed with is size. And this sometimes works, right? So we know, for example, I'm going to grab someone to demonstrate. We know that that little juvenile red king crab I just showed you is obviously younger than this big mature female red king crab, right? So in that instance, size does work to tell us how old the crab is, or at least if one crab is older than the other. But sometimes we have crab that live in different habitats. So these two females are both red king crab, and they're actually the exact same age, but look at their difference in size, right? So that's a pretty big difference right there. And this is because these two crab are from different populations and live in different habitats. So their growth rates differ and they reach different sizes at maturity. So it's kind of like if you look around at your classmates right now, you guys are probably all close to the same age, but I'm guessing that you all aren't the same height, right? So sometimes size is maybe not the best indication of age. And next, counting growth rings on their exoskeleton. And someone made a really good point that maybe this is not possible, like a tree ring, to count any kind of growth rings because we know a crab molts, right? So they leave behind this hard outer shell that might have growth rings like a tree. And because they shed this, they don't retain any of those growth rings, which is very much true for our crab species that we have here in Kodiak. And what's really interesting is that some crustacean species like lobsters, scientists have actually discovered that in their eye stalks, they actually have growth rings that they can count to age, but that doesn't quite work for crab yet. Looking at the age of the exoskeleton or the shell, a lot of people asked about that. And someone actually said again that that probably wouldn't work because crab molts. And you are partially right, because we know that a species like red king crab, they tend to molt fairly frequently when they're young. And then as they get older, they molt once a year. But that was a little bit of a trick question because our snow crab and our tanner crab that live up here in Alaska actually stop molting once they reach maturity. So that's why we can use things like these, and you can see he's got a bunch of barnacles on his shell. We can actually use that as an indication of how long it's been since he last molted, which is kind of an indicator for age. So, well, raise your hand if you like SpongeBob. SpongeBob fans? I love SpongeBob, but I think SpongeBob maybe had it wrong because when I think of crusty crab, I think of a crab that looks like this. So it doesn't even really look like a crab, right? That's a male snow crab, and you can see he's covered in barnacles. Like you almost can't even see his leg. And he's actually got an anemone growing on the top of his head. So this male might be as old as 15 years old. And we can basically, all those things that he has on his shell kind of tell us that it's been a long time since he last molted, and we can use that as an indicator for age. But if you picked any one of those hypotheses on the last slide, those were all great guesses because scientists are still understanding how to best age a crab, and we really don't know. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you guys have.
That's great. And actually, we did have a question about how old can crabs get? So you did say that that one crab was 15 years old, but are there crabs that get older than that?
Yeah, so, and that's a hard question to ask, right? Because we just really discovered that we can't actually age a crab unless we hold them for their entire lifetime in a laboratory, which probably isn't very realistic. But people think, for example, red king crab could live 18 to 20 years, snow crab maybe 15 years. So not a really long lifetime compared to some of the mammals that we know of and ourselves as well. But I think that's still pretty long for a crab, unless of course they get taken by a fishery and we eat them. Then they're going to live a little bit, not quite as long life, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's very interesting that different crab species might live different lengths of time. Rachel was wondering, what is the biggest crab in the world?
Oh, biggest crab in the world. Oh gosh. Ooh, okay, so Leah had to help me out on that. She said the Japanese spider crab probably has it, so that carapace that we talked about, but then also their leg span, right? So Japanese spider crabs.
Oh, very interesting. And then one last question before we move to the next section. Theodore had wondered, do all crabs walk sideways?
Good question. So it depends on, all crab are capable of moving sideways, yes, definitely, because that's kind of one of their major defense mechanisms, right? They can kind of scuttle side to side, and that's probably the quickest way for them to move. So a hermit crab, for example, Leah told you that if they're out of their shell, they have those 4 legs that they use as walking legs. Might maybe have a little bit more difficult time moving quicker side to side than, for example, like a king crab that could move side to side with big long legs. But yes, they are all capable of moving side to side.
Great. All right, well, I know that we have one last section, and I know we're getting close to our 45 minutes, but we're going to try to push through because I know that Leah has some interesting stuff to talk to us about.
Thank you all. Back to talk about where do crabs go? So we're going to talk about some movement of crabs and how we can figure out how crabs move. Now, it can be really important to understand where animals, including crabs, go at different times of the year. For example, they may use different habitats at different times of the year. So we may need to make sure we can protect their habitats at all times of the year. So it's important to be able to kind of track their movement. So how would you track a crab's movements across the ocean floor? Any guesses?
Let's see. So if you have a guess about how scientists might know where crabs go, type it into the chat. We've got a couple of guesses. Rachel had put in a guess. Theodore was saying maybe with tags or transmitters. Michelle was saying tags. So what do you think, Leah?
Great job. So several of you mentioned tagging. So that is generally what we use is tagging. Now, if we only wanted to know where a crab was moving for a really short time period, like a couple of days, we could send out, say, a scuba diver to follow them, or set up some cameras. But for longer time periods, like months and years, using tags is a really good method. And there's a lot of different ways to tag a crab. And I'm going to be going over these. So let's start out with the simplest method. I'm going to get a crab out for you here. Part of my research is doing tagging with red-fin crabs, so this is something that I get really excited about. So there's two different tags on this crab. So the simplest type of tags is just to put a number on the crab, so we can mark what crab this is. So if we find it again, and we find it in a different place, we know that it's that particular crab and then it moves somewhere. This is just a little ID tag that's just zip tied onto the crab's leg, and that can tell us where the crab is moving to if we catch it again. Now the problem with this type of tagging method is if the crab molts, the tag will stay with the leg of the molt and we'll lose the tag. So for king crabs, biologists have figured out a really neat way to tag crabs with these pieces of plastic, basically. It's called a spaghetti tag. It's kind of like spaghetti. And it also just has a little number ID tag on it. But it's right at the back where the carapace would break open when the crab molts. And this crab is actually not just through the shell, but it's through the muscle at the back of the crab. So when the crab molts, this tag will stay on. So these tags, biologists have tagged them and then found crabs over 10 years later that still had this tag on them, and they were much bigger because they've gone through many, many molts. So that's a really neat way to tag crabs, and we can tag a lot of crabs with these simple tags. But the tricky part is actually finding the crab again. We caught it once, we tagged it, but then we need to get it back in order to figure out where it moved and what habitat it's using after it moved. And the best way to do that is to have fishermen help you. These fishermen are putting out lots of crab pots and catching lots of crab, and we really work with a lot of fishermen to tell us when they catch a tagged crab, and they tell us what the number is and where they found it, and that can be really helpful. But one of the problems with this type of tagging is that sometimes we might not have a fishery at a particular time of year when we're interested in where crabs are, or it might be a species of crab that there is no fishery for. So we need to think about some other types of tagging methods. Now, one type of tagging method is acoustic tagging. So I'll show you, this is an acoustic tag. Now, it doesn't look like much, but we would attach it just at the back of the carapace. We'd attach it right onto this spaghetti tag. So it could also be retained through the molt, just like the simpler spaghetti tag is. Now, what is an acoustic tag? So let's look at what an acoustic tag is. So this tag is continuously sending out a signal. About once every minute, it sends out a signal into the water as the crab is walking on the ocean floor. It's just a simple little signal that says what number it is. So it says, I'm tag 123. And it does that over and over. And then you have to have a receiver, so that's what this black tube is, that can pick up that signal and decode it after it goes through the water. Now you can put these receivers in all different kinds of places. You can put them attached to the ocean floor. So if a crab happens to walk by a particular place in the ocean floor, and it can pick up that signal. Or what I do, instead of having it on a stationary place on the ocean floor, I attach these receivers to drones. So this is a picture of a sail drone. It's a sailboat-like drone that we send out into the Bering Sea to pick up the signals from tagged crabs. So here on this map, those black lines are transects that the sail drone went back and forth across the ocean. And the receiver was pointing straight down at the bottom so it could pick up these signals from the tagged crabs. So that yellow cross is where we tagged all of our crabs a couple years ago. And then the red triangles are where we found them. So we tagged crabs in the summer, but then we picked up the signals with the drones in the fall. And it might not look like the crabs moved very far on this map, but they actually moved around 30 to 60 miles in 4 months, which is pretty good for a little crab kind of running across the ocean floor. That's pretty neat. Now, one of the problems with acoustic tagging is that we have to send out a drone, or we have to have some type of receiver to pick up the signal. So there's one more type of tagging that I want to show you. Just getting out crab. This crab has, so this crab has what is called a satellite tag on top of it. So it's a much bigger tag. You can see it has this antenna at the top. So we can't attach it to the back of the carapace on that spaghetti tag like we did with the acoustic tag because it's just too big. It also, these satellite tags are buoyant. So they, instead of hanging behind the crab, they actually, when it's in the water, it floats above the crab. So we attach it to this harness. So it can't be retained through the molt. So we have to be careful on when we tag the crab, make sure the crab isn't going to molt when the satellite tag is out. But the really neat thing about these satellite tags is that they don't have to have a receiver to help pick up the signal. So we can, before we put this tag on a crab, we program it to pop to the surface, to release from the crab, and then it will float up to the surface on a specific date. So on that date, it releases from the crab, floats to the surface, and then it uses this antenna to transmit to satellites. And it can transmit its location. So that's how we can figure out where a crab is at a very specific time. And that's neat because we can pick whatever time we want of the year when we want to know where these crab are. We program the satellite tags to release. So I have some really exciting news for you guys, is that right at this very moment, we have biologists from Noaa and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game and a group that works with the crab industry. And they're all out on this boat out in the Bering Sea tagging red king crab with these satellite tags. They're right in the middle of the project right now. And this is exciting because they're mostly tagging female red king crab, and the satellite tags are going to release from the crab in the spring. So they're going to tell us where these crab are in the spring. This is such an interesting time of year for female red king crab because that's when they're releasing those little larvae are hatching and going up into the water column, those ones that Erin showed you pictures of. So we're really excited about this project, and hopefully we'll have more news on it soon. So with that, I would love to take any more questions you have about tagging or anything else that we've talked about.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So Ms. Sarai's class was asking, how do you folks know that the different types of tags don't hurt or bother the crabs?
That's a really good question. We can compare tagging methods. There have been some studies using, for example, acoustic and satellite tagging methods because the satellite tag is so big, we're kind of worried it might slow the crab down. So there's been some studies with that. So we've also held crab in the laboratory to compare them if they are less, or if they're more likely to die if they have a tag in them. So far, I haven't found. I've done these experiments and I haven't found any higher mortality rates in the tagged crab than the crab that don't have tags. But that's a great question.
Yeah, and it's all I think that it also shows that, you know, to do these experiments, you have to make sure that they're not making an impact on the animals. So it's very interesting to hear the experiments that you've done in the lab to look at whether the instruments have an impact on the crabs. It looks like we are just about at the end of our time. So thank you very much, Erin and Leah, for the information that you've shared with us. That was an amazing talk, and I think we all learned a lot, and hopefully our viewers can share our new knowledge with their friends and family. So I had also wanted to mention that we have 2 upcoming Noaa Live webinars on Friday, November the 12th and Saturday, November the 13th. So that's next Friday and Saturday. They're part of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum Family Day events. Friday's webinar will be on using planes, drones, and satellites to study and protect plants and animals with Noaa. So, you know, the tagging information that you gave, Leah, fits right in with that. And then Saturday's webinar will be on monitoring weather around the world with Noaa Live. We'll have some of our all-stars coming back, and they should be fun in their presentations. So more details on our webinars are on the Woods Hole Sea Grant website. For our viewers, please stay tuned for a post-webinar survey because we'd love your feedback and for information on past and upcoming webinars, or to receive a Noaa Live iron-on patch, please visit the website at Woods Hole Sea Grant. So we're looking forward to seeing you at our next webinar. And thank you, Erin and Leah, again for your presentation, and we will see you next time. Thanks very much.
Bye, everyone. Bye. Thank you.